Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a seminar by an old friend from Canada, Dalhousie University, who we have had contacts with for many years. I think you've read about all these titles with CMI and with Canada, but I think I want to stress one important thing about Aldo, in addition to the fact that he's an old friend, is that he's one of the very few individuals that is an expert on law of the sea, the IMO and the regulation of international shipping, and private maritime law. Normally we're all in our own stovepipes and we pretend what we do is more important and we don't have to learn about what people in the other division are doing. So he bridges that very important gap between the three disciplines in effect. And therefore we have been enjoying his company the last 2 days, but also he met with our researchers this morning with a very stimulating discussion. We hope to continue to pick his brain over the next few days. But for now, I'd like to have him present his lecture today on MARPOL, which is marine pollution. Okay, go ahead, Aldo.
Great. Well, thanks very much for the kind words, Bob, and it's always a wonderful experience to be here. And special thanks to the Center for International Law for inviting me. And thank you all for coming out to listen to my presentation. Yes, I've had a long-standing connection with Singapore and the US, at least since 1987. That was the first time I visited Singapore. And it was a collaborative activity on maritime boundary delimitation with a focus on Southeast Asia. And at the time, it was a collaborative activity between who were my professors at the time at Dalhousie, Douglas Johnston, Edgar Gold, and teaming up with colleagues from Singapore here, among others. And I recall a very, very successful workshop. And I never thought at the time that that would only be the beginning of a long-standing relationship. So thank you for having me over. I was asked to speak to this topic today. Everybody is familiar with this acronym MARPOL, which stands for the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. And but it's good to sometimes take maybe a few steps backwards, from what is familiar, and to think about it. What is it that this instrument is doing, and how well is it doing for what it is intended? So, given that MARPOL recently celebrated its 50th anniversary, and 50th anniversary since its first adoption in 1973 as a convention. I should perhaps underscore that we adopted it as a convention, and before it even came into force, we needed to amend it and then re-adopt it. But in any case, 1973 was a seminal year. So we've had 50 years. And 50 years is a good time to reflect and think about an instrument and to see what it has achieved. And indeed, this was something which was essentially an event at the IMO and as you can imagine, IMO delegations thinking about what have we achieved with an instrument of this sort. So hence my subtitle, Retrospect and Prospects. But I'd like to speak to MARPOL not simply as a convention. That would be a very narrow way of characterizing this rather important regime, but rather as a system. And that's one of the things I want to explain too, that MARPOL is a complex regulatory structure. Perhaps the word regime really is what captures it best. And therefore, to fully appreciate it, we've got a good sense of what is its scope, what is it trying to do. So I thought I will proceed with this discussion through a series of questions. Some are perhaps very basic questions, but you can see the logic of what I propose. First of all, to at least have an even playing field for everybody, let's say a few words about what is it in the first place. And then essentially move on to trying to contextualize what MARPOL is trying to achieve against the kinds of pollution risks that ships pose. And then reflect a little bit about its history, why and how did it actually come about. And it's changed over time. How has it evolved? And then again, focus a little bit more on the content. So what does it actually aim to achieve? How does it do this? And this is where much of my discussion will be about the regulatory strategy of MARPOL. And then pose the question, to what extent has it achieved its goals? And indeed, what contemporary challenges does it face? Or at least, I think it faces. And I will conclude with the last question, basically speaking to prospects for this vital convention. So here we go. First of all, what is MARPOL? And at the outset, I should say that this is easily the most important convention concerning vessel source pollution. We have a number of international instruments out there. And this one, though, stands heads perhaps and shoulders over the others because of its comprehensive nature. So when I say there are other international instruments concerning the risks, the environmental risks that ships pose, I'm referring to the Convention on Anti-Fouling Systems on Ships, the Convention on Ballast Waters Management, and perhaps we can even say, look, the London Convention and Protocol also concern, in part, pollution from ships, because ships are also instruments for dumping of waste into the marine environment. But MARPOL stands above these instruments because of its scope, but also level of complexity. It addresses pollution from a number of possible angles. Pollution when it is caused intentionally, but also pollution may be the result of negligence on board the vessel, and sometimes when there is an accident and essentially a harmful waste is released from on board the ship. MARPOL addresses really all forms of shipping. It's not simply for commercial vessels. So, for instance, if we think in terms of one of the sources of pollution that is addressed, or types of pollution, i.e. garbage, MARPOL essentially sets out rules for all ships. So we're looking at commercial vessels, but also fishing vessels are captured by these rules. And indeed, these rules have been extended also to offshore installations and structures. And they extend also to recreational vessels. Members, state parties have essentially pretty much extended the scope of this instrument to apply to all kinds of shipping. And you can understand the logic of this, because there are certain types of pollution which really emanate from all kinds of ships. So with garbage, for instance, if we think in terms of recreational vessels, there was a study done by the US Coast Guard many, many years ago that, the average yacht in US waters could produce a few kilos of waste every day. So that's just recreational vessels. Now imagine, of course, larger vessels where you might have an entire community on board, such as cruise ships, and the amount of garbage that can be produced among other types of waste. An important thing to underscore about MARPOL is that it is an instrument that has been literally responding to and working closely with business developments, science, and technology. And indeed, after all, the ship is a piece of technology, isn't it? And the equipment, the various types of equipment on board a ship, essentially are the various components that enable the operation of a ship. And therefore, if there are developments in any particular technology on board a ship, it will affect, of course, the operation of the ship. And the IMO has kept a close eye on technological developments to ensure that its regulation tries to keep as much as possible in step. In reality, of course, it's easier said than done, because very often technological development and indeed commercial development are triggers for regulation rather than the other way around. And regulation tends to be more responsive, reacting perhaps to those developments. Perhaps we might see a little bit of a change there, or at least we hope there will be a bit of a difference in terms of approach, rather than being reactive to be proactive, with respect to the decarbonization of shipping and autonomous ships. And why? Because here there is an opportunity, at least with these two issue areas, to be more proactive in regulation. But even with decarbonization, we see that there's so much technological development, even with fuel development and so on, that we are already in developing a regime at the IMO trying to respond to technologies that have already produced some interesting results. Another important function of MARPOL is its relationship with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The UNCLOS has quite a few provisions in major regimes that concern navigation rights, where, in essence, there is an expectation that there is compliance with generally accepted international rules and standards adopted by the competent international organization on matters concerning navigation and shipping. And the consensus out there is that these references refer to the IMO and the work of the IMO conventions and other instruments. And therefore, if we look at MARPOL with respect to pollution prevention and the UNCLOS provisions with respect to pollution prevention, MARPOL plays an important role as an agent, if you want, of the law of the sea. And another way to look at it is too that the umbrella, the applicability of MARPOL is further extended because of this umbrella provided by UNCLOS. So there is this interesting synergistic relationship between the two. MARPOL is a system of instruments that has broad acceptance among states. I have the figure 100 to 160 because, as I will show shortly, when a state becomes party to MARPOL, it has a choice whether it wants to become party only to the mandatory instruments or also to the optional instruments. But if we look at the full range of instruments, so essentially the convention and the various annexes, we see that there is a very high rate of subscription, and most importantly, representing the vast majority of global tonnage. As you can appreciate with the regulation of shipping, it's not enough to have as many state parties as possible to an instrument. What is really vital is that those state parties represent as much tonnage as possible. So in other words, they're representing the shipping that is flying their flag. So that way, the strength of the instrument lies, of course, the number of state parties, but also to as much global shipping as possible. One other characteristic of MARPOL is that it is administered by the Marine Environment Protection Committee. And indeed, the Marine Environment Protection Committee here can be described as having grown together with MARPOL as MARPOL was growing. And today, indeed, much of the work of MEPC is really MARPOL. So if you look at any MEPC meeting and you look at the agenda, you will see that at least half of the agenda will be MARPOL related. Of course, there are other instruments. Of course, there are other important issues. But it gives you a sense of the significance of this instrument and the many issues that need to be constantly addressed. So let's move on to pollution risks. So ships produce so many risks to the marine environment, but pollution, of course, in particular. I'm not going to mention all the risks here, but simply were to think in terms of pollution per se. If we think in terms of the cargo carried on board ships, there's the possibility of operational waste share or accidental losses. That cargo can be carried in bulk or can be perhaps in packaged form. And this cargo could be oil, could be dangerous goods, could be sometimes perhaps as part of following the transfer of a cargo, the unloading, there might be cargo residue on board. That cargo residue may need to be cleaned because there's another cargo that is going to be taken on board. And of course, what do you do with the wash water, et cetera, et cetera. So every single step potentially is a pollution risk when we're dealing with that kind of cargo. Then there is the ship itself. The ship itself could potentially be a form of pollution, if you want, if you have a ship that is lost at sea. The material on board the ship, perhaps insulation material in the old days, a lot of asbestos was used on ships. Now there's supposed to be less and less of it, but of course, as we are breaking down older ships, they're being recycled and so on, asbestos is being exposed in recycling operations. Ships are noisy machines, so that's another form of pollution. There are, of course, anti-fouling systems. If we think in terms of those ships that used paints that had tributylene as a substance in those paints, that's a toxic substances and toxic to the marine environment as well as, of course, to humans. Then there's the equipment. Equipment may need oil lubricants. The engine room itself might produce a range of waste. And if the ship is operating a scrubber to remove sulfur from the combusted fuel, whether it is open or closed loop, there is essentially a lot of waste, a lot of potentially harmful waste that is released. I'll have something more to say about scrubbers a little later, because scrubbers raise an interesting question concerning consistency of regulation. One of the issues that we've seen recently is that the current practice of the use of scrubbers is or may be potentially inconsistent with states' obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea with respect to protection and preservation of the marine environment. Operations, you can have bilge waste. We have, of course, the emissions from the combustion, and there are so many different substances, as I will show later. There's, of course, also ballast water that needs to go somewhere. So if we look at the risks, there are quite a substantial list of risks simply from cargo and vessel. But then let's not forget that there are people on board ships as well. So you have waste that relate to the human presence, crews and passengers. We're thinking in particular of sewage, grey water, but also garbage. And if you simply have a crew on a commercial vessel, you might have simply 20, 25 persons perhaps. That's one thing. But if you have a cruise ship with several thousand persons on board, you can understand here that that is a potential source of major pollution if we did not have rules to essentially control how sewage, grey water, and garbage are addressed on board these ships. So, how did MARPOL come about? The idea of addressing wastes produced from ships was not a creation of MARPOL. Indeed, concern with oil pollution was already anticipated in the 1950s. And that concern was, of course, at the time with the growth of oil tankers. If you think in terms of the size of oil tankers, you see, until the Second World War, and perhaps a few years after the Second World War, tanker sizes would be between 10 and 20,000 tons. But that was well before we suddenly saw very large crude carriers, and then ultimately ultra-large crude carriers. And very large crude carriers could displace something like 100,000 plus tons. If we go all the way up to ultra-large, to 300,000 tons. So these are huge vessels with an ultra-large carrier that can carry perhaps 2 million barrels of oil on board a ship. And these ships, when they were first built, were single-hulled. It was amazing. It was an amazing piece of engineering. But also when you think in terms of the amount of crude that they could carry. And if there was a casualty, what potentially was lost to the marine environment and the impact on the marine environment. So there was already concern about this in the 1950s, and that was one reason why OilPol was adopted, so this first convention. And indeed, OilPol was really a precursor of Annex 1 of MARPOL. So we think in terms of Annex 1 MARPOL, essentially the starting point there was OilPol and then build on OilPol. We understood the scope of the problem really with Torrey Canyon. So Torrey Canyon was a modern tanker which grounded off the coast of Cornwall, United Kingdom. And it caused a massive spill. And that spill basically demonstrated fundamental weaknesses in international law broadly. There were some fundamental questions in public international law. How could a coastal state protect itself when there is a floating risk just outside its territorial sea? And at the time, most states claim that 3 nautical mile territorial sea, so that would be pretty close to the coast. If you have a disabled tanker there, what do you do? What sort of jurisdiction can you exercise over a vessel on the high seas? And but at the same time, that casualty demonstrated the kind of damage that could be caused and the absence of essentially any structures and processes that could provide proper compensation and, of course, also to cover the costs of cleanup and operation. In addition to that, that casualty demonstrated how insufficient the IMO was at the time. Because when Torrey Canyon happened, basically, IMO was still operating only with one committee, with the Maritime Safety Committee. See, IMO was established, was created by treaty in 1948, operationalized only in 1958, and primarily as a consultative advisory body on maritime safety matters. And then we had these big pollution problems, and suddenly we realized, you know, what should be expected from this body? And this, it was Torrey Canyon, I think, to a great extent, that helped lead to the establishment of the legal committee and eventually, of course, the Marine Environment Protection Committee. And with these developments, the IMO grew from a consultative organization to more of a regulatory body. In 1972, the United Nations General Assembly convened the first mega conference on the environment in Stockholm. And this conference produced a plan of action. And one of the concerns that was put forward by this conference was essentially the risks posed by pollution from ships. And indeed, the conference proposed the need for integrated approaches to problems of the environment. And that eventually translated into a comprehensive approach to pollution from ships. However, the wheels of international organizations tend to be slow moving, the bureaucracy perhaps involved and so on. And what we saw in the 1970s was a series of tanker casualties following Torrey Canyon, which showed more and more the fundamental weaknesses in the organization and in the law, basically, not only in terms of standards for these vessels, but also in terms of rules, more specifically, to protect the marine environment from pollution from ships. With 1973, we see, as a result, the adoption of MARPOL as the, at least initial response, as a comprehensive instrument. But MARPOL was adopted not without internal disagreement. We had not yet arrived to a point where decisions would really be consensus-based. And because of that, basically, it took some time before MARPOL would actually enter into force. But for our purposes, there was the creation also of the Marine Environment Protection Committee, which was going to be the body that would help administer MARPOL. We needed another oil spill to essentially bring MARPOL into operation. Amoco Cadiz led to yet another conference to review MARPOL before it was accepted, to address those differences, particularly in the first two annexes, and essentially to amend the entire convention, re-adopt it in a protocol, and then hopefully try to bring it into force as soon as possible. But it would take a few more years before MARPOL did come into force, but it was the MARPOL Convention and Annex 1. Annex 2 had to be postponed, even though it was one of the mandatory annexes, and indeed it entered into force in 1983, on the 2nd of October. So what we see here is quite a massive effort, which took almost 10 years, as it were, of pushing this elephant into the international regulatory scene, and eventually to bring it into force. Once it was brought into force, it became a dynamic instrument. So, first of all, the Annex 2, which had a delayed effect, did eventually enter into force in 1987. In 1988, we see the adoption, or rather the operationalization, bring it into force, I suppose, would be the better way to put it, of Annex 5. In 1992, was followed by Annex 3. 2003, Annex 4. So 5 is garbage, 3 is hazardous substances carried in packaged form. Annex 4 is sewage. And then in 2005, we see work basically that had started earlier in 1997 to bring Annex 6, to develop Annex 6, and eventually, of course, add it to the convention and bring it into force. So essentially, we've had an instrument that grew over time, came into force over time, depending, of course, on the levels of support that could be generated behind an annex at a particular moment. And since then, in addition to the amendments that were necessary to expand, to amend and expand the main convention, we've had numerous amendments of MARPOL. So it's been amended, at least by my count, 89 times, with the latest amendments essentially to create the emission control areas in Canadian Arctic waters and in Norwegian waters. And they've become effective this year on the 1st of March. I should have put 2026. So a dynamic instrument or series of instruments which are better called a system. So looking at the big picture of MARPOL, what is it trying to achieve? And we go to the preamble of the convention. The desire here is to achieve, very strong language, complete elimination of intentional pollution of the marine environment. So certainly this, you can imagine, is already perhaps more of an aspirational kind of goal, more than anything else. But also, the idea is to try to minimize accidental discharges of substances. So basically, it's an instrument that is trying to address both intentional and accidental. And you're probably wondering, why should we have intentional pollution? Well, in a sense, it's because ships produce a range of waste purely because of the way they're designed, the equipment, and the way they are operated. So because they're operated the way they're expected to be operated, in a sense, the pollution that they generate is intentional to some extent. The interesting thing to keep in mind, too, in terms of what MARPOL is trying to achieve, is it's encompassing flex states and port states. So MARPOL is really clearly about ships. It's about standards for ships. But it's also about services provided to ships. So if we think in terms of the waste that ships generate and preventing their release into the marine environment necessarily requires that these wastes are received somewhere. And this is where ports and those states basically that are engaged in maritime activity are expected to provide reception facilities for a variety of waste from ships. So we have standards for those expectations. And indeed, states here are expected to notify the IMO if they are unable to provide those services. So the IMO has responded with respect to, for instance, island states. A group of island states presented their concern that, look, what do we do with the waste that we receive from ships because of our limitations, geographical, economic, environmental. So the IMO there became a forum for a discussion of their specific concerns. And MARPOL has accommodated the need for a regional approach with respect to island states. It's not that their obligation is lessened, it's that their obligation is to be performed at the regional level rather than on a state by, or rather island state basis. So the big question is really, how does MARPOL aim to achieve its goals? And this is where the bulk of my presentation lies. So I mentioned it's a comprehensive approach because it addresses multiple sources of pollution. And indeed, what we have seen over time is expansion of the types of pollution that ships produce that are regulated by MARPOL. And indeed, there has been discussion now for quite some time at the IMO to look at gray water as potentially another type of pollution produced from ships that ought to be included. It's a system of layered regulations in the sense of we have different types of instruments, and I'll show you what they look like on the next slide. The goal is to produce uniform rules and standards concerning how we design ships, how they're built, how they're equipped, and how they're operated. So the idea here is that trade really is global. The shipping industry operates on a global basis. And it is essential that the rules concerning vessel source pollution are the same, or for the most part are the same, because there are some variations, regional variations, wherever ships trade. So we have consistency in the operation of ships around the world. These rules and standards are updated regularly. So I mentioned the number of amendments that have taken place. And there's a special procedure that has been developed for the amendment of MARPOL. And this is where the Marine Environment Protection Committee comes in. So MARPOL is a technical instrument. And imagine if an instrument such as this, which is a treaty, were to be amended, as would usually be the case with any other convention or treaty, it would be a complex, lengthy process. But the nature of the technical regulation requires that there's a much faster process, and to facilitate the entry into force of those amended rules and standards as soon as possible. So essentially, the tacit acceptance procedure was really a creation of the IMO, and for such instruments as MARPOL, SOLAS, key instruments, to enable these instruments to be maintained technically relevant on a fairly regular basis without engaging diplomatic processes. So essentially, unless there is very strong objection from a substantial portion of member states, and of course representing a substantial portion of tonnage, then the amendments are deemed to be accepted within a designated period. So in other words, the rules are entering the force if you stay quiet. And it is a system that has worked and continues to work, for the most part, reasonably well. What sort of regulations do we have here? Yes, they are technical, for the most part. And it's really a mixture of prescriptive and goal-based regulation. And what we see here is kind of change underway at the IMO in terms of how maritime regulation is taking place. So historically, the regulation of ships has been primarily prescriptive, with very clear standards, quantified. Essentially, what ships had to comply with was a precise, quantified standard. The problem with that approach is that when you have areas of high technological development, the prescriptive approach may create obstacles for technological development and embracing new technologies. On top of that, it might create certain inefficiencies in terms of complying. The idea behind goal-based regulation is to move away from specific prescriptions and instead establish goals. So this is the goal that is expected to be reached, and then it's up to the regulatee to reach that goal in what is the most effective way, and efficient, of course, and cost effective. And therefore, they are incentivized to develop technologies to enable them to meet that goal. This was started in 2003, primarily with respect to ship construction. But now we're seeing this approach also making headways into pollution prevention, and specifically with Annex 6. If we think in terms of energy efficiency standards, for instance, and where we're moving overall with the decarbonization of shipping, because this is a problematic perhaps, which relies on technology and technological development, goals enable the industry to have room for maneuver in complying with their obligations by developing technologies. Of course, there are risks here for industry because it might mean that in meeting a particular goal, you might have early movers, and then it might turn out that perhaps there might be a better technology down the road, which will perhaps push the standard in another direction. So there are certain risks for the industry here as well. But for us, what it means too is that we have goals that are set at the IMO level, but we also have a role for industry to help populate those goals with technical standards. And classification societies here play a very important role. And together, through their association, the International Association of Classification Societies, from time to time, they produce what are called uniform rules. So the various classification societies will coordinate their rules into uniform rules. And those uniform rules, in some cases, are referentially incorporated in the IMO codes, as is the case, for instance, of the Polar Code. So it's, as you can imagine here, a rather interesting but quite complex type of regulation, because it's not simply the traditional regulation of simply having a regulator and saying, look, these are the standards you have to meet, full stop. No, that's not where we're going. Rather, the burden on meeting the compliance through whatever technologies you can develop is on you, the regulatee. MARPOL relies very heavily on a system of certification and documentation. The evidence that you're actually complying with the goals and specific standards where we have very specific standards. And these are based also on a system of mutual recognition. So essentially, state parties to MARPOL agree that they are going to essentially respect and recognize each other's certificates. And also, they agree to a system of inspection of those documents in port. The substantive part of MARPOL comes into how waste is managed on board, and ultimately, of course, for discharge at the port reception facilities. In addition to that, MARPOL takes into consideration that there are certain parts of the marine environment which are so sensitive that they require a higher standard with respect to waste management. So we have general rules for waste management that apply to all marine areas of the marine environment. And then we have higher standards for particular areas of the marine environment, which have been designated as special areas. MARPOL also strengthens the role and responsibilities, if you want, of national authorities. So national authorities are expected clearly to really exercise effective jurisdiction and control over their ships. This is, of course, also a fundamental obligation in UNCLOS. Article 94 makes it very clear that if you are a flag state, if you want to get into the business of shipping, you must exercise effective jurisdiction and control over your ships. With respect to pollution prevention, that role is significantly strengthened in MARPOL. So essentially, the National Maritime Administration is recognized as having a range of powers to be able to implement and enforce the MARPOL standards. The National Maritime Administration sometimes, or actually more often than not, require assistance. There was a time when flag states could simply rely on civil servants to do their work. Today, there are more and more flag states out there that are relying on services provided by industry bodies. More specifically, classification societies that qualify as recognized organizations, so recognized, of course, under IMO rules, but also by the National Maritime Administration, as organizations that can offer services which would usually be offered by public authorities. And therefore, they are delegated to exercise certain functions that would usually be public authority functions. So recognized organizations as private bodies, in a sense, could be functioning as agents of the National Maritime Administration with respect to certification, documentation, certain kinds of inspections. So as you can imagine, this is actually quite an important development, because what we have here is, on the one hand, under UNCLOS, the flag state has a fundamental duty to exercise effective jurisdiction and control, but the flag state may indeed be undertaking that function through the agency of industry bodies. And this is accompanied by the port inspection system. So essentially, state parties to MARPOL agree to inspect ships and to do so on the basis of no more favorable treatment. So essentially, ships entering ports are inspected for MARPOL compliance, and it doesn't matter where those ships are flagged. If those ships are flagged under states that are not parties to MARPOL, nonetheless, the MARPOL standards are still applied to them on the basis of no more favorable treatment. So I mentioned the MARPOL system, and this gives you a sense of the complexity of this layered system of regulation. You have the parent convention on top, you have a number of protocols, essentially setting out the bigger rules, if you want, of the system. And then we have the annexes. This is where the major regulation takes place. And then we have a system of nitty-gritty regulations through mandatory codes. Some codes, such as the last two, for instance, are codes that are also under the auspices of SOLAS. In addition to that, we have guidelines and circulars. And sometimes the guidelines, partly because they are so detailed in assisting the implementation of a particular rule within the system, they themselves may be referentially incorporated in the legislation of states. So Canada has, for instance, pretty much given legal authority to guidelines in a number of issue areas, such as, for instance, guidelines with respect to scrubbers. They are not just guidelines in Canada, there's something more. The discharges and emissions. So oil clearly is the big one. That includes heavy fuel oil, noxious liquid substances carried in bulk. The same when they're carried in packaged form. Sewage, range of rules here with respect to treatment. What can be discharged at sea? MARPOL is not about zero discharge of everything into the marine environment. It's rather managed discharge, and of course, what may not be discharged into the marine environment and must be left at the port reception facilities. So depending on the wastes, there might be distance criteria in terms of how far from the coast that a particular discharge may occur, or in the case of the polar regions where there is landfast ice, how far out. At the moment, we are still waiting for harder rules on grey water. Garbage, again, it's a system of management on board the ship. There are many different types of garbage because, as you can imagine, there is garbage from packaging, there is garbage from the kitchen, and the garbage in the kitchen may include plastics, it may include carcasses of animals, and so on. So we have rules for these. And indeed, things like, for instance, a carcass of an animal cannot be discharged in the Arctic because of the danger of pathogens that might be introduced in the region. And then plastics, for instance, are subject to zero discharge. Air pollution, by far, well, there was a time when we thought that Annex 1 is the most complex annex, and primarily because, of course, the complexity of the construction, design requirements, and so on. But air pollution generally has become a really, really complex topic. And there's a wide range of harmful substances that are released. And indeed, the biggest issue being addressed at this time is how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ships, so the decarbonization of shipping. I mentioned special areas, so those areas that are subject to higher standards. So there's various ways that I mentioned earlier. Well, the way they are dealt with in these areas is indeed to a higher standard, which very often means almost zero discharge of almost anything. What is a special area? It's an area which is particularly sensitive because of its oceanographical and ecological conditions, and because of the particular traffic in the area, there is added risk to that sensitive marine ecosystem. So we have special areas in several parts of the world, and I'll show you shortly. And then we have also special rules for the polar regions. Now, this is not to test your eyesight, but just to give you a sense of the complexity of the special area designations. And indeed, look, it's a pretty long list, and this can be accessed very easily, online on the IMO. You will see here basically that they are divided pretty much by annex. And then if we look at Annex 6, by type of pollutant, air pollutant that is addressed. And the rest of the data here gives an idea of when it was adopted and when it came into force. So MARPOL, therefore, is not simply about global rules and standards across the board. It's also about area-based management. So there are certain areas that require higher standards. I mentioned reception facilities. So special areas are designated on the basis of an important condition, that those states that propose these special areas in their region must then eventually communicate to the IMO Secretary General that those port reception facilities are in fact in place. And those special areas do not become effective until the port reception facilities are operative. So what this has meant in practice is we've had quite a time lag with some special areas, for instance, for the Black Sea, among others, that have taken many, many years before they could become effective because there weren't sufficient reception facilities. In some regions, and I mentioned already small islands, but this is also the case with the Arctic, there has had to be an adjustment to the strategy for port reception facilities so that this requirement could be discharged not on a state-by-state basis, but on a regional basis. Because the expectation of port reception facilities is really an expectation to have these facilities wherever you have a port or you have terminals that are, for instance, handling oil and so on. And that could be challenging in a region where, okay, what if you don't have ports? Like the Canadian Arctic, there are very, very few ports. So for Canada to be able to provide port reception facilities, it would have to be outside Arctic waters mostly. So Halifax, my city, Port of Halifax, and Vancouver at the other end play actually important roles as places for receiving waste from ships that have transited Arctic waters. So port inspections, they are vital. This is what essentially ensures that the regulations have teeth. So the ship certificates are inspected, and indeed they have to be verified. If there is an issue which does not correspond to the descriptions on the certificates, that indeed may necessitate a detention of the vessel if the vessel poses an environmental threat. And that is actually a significant deterrent for the most part, although we still have detentions. Why? Because if you think in terms of what is the charter rate for a ship, and to have a ship stuck in port detained because there's a MARPOL violation, it could be anywhere depending on the vessel concerned, perhaps from $25,000 to $100,000 a day. So it's a sufficient disincentive. But even with that, there are still detentions of ships, and I'll show you some figures for that. So those ships that are detained, at the most, they might be given permission to move to the closest yard to fix the problem that they have before they can continue to trade. So this also empowers the port state to actually refuse entry to a ship which is not in compliance with MARPOL. Most importantly, as I mentioned earlier, no more favorable treatment. The rules apply to your ships whether you are party to MARPOL or not. So moving on, has MARPOL achieved its goals? Well, former Secretary General Keetak Lim, on the 50th anniversary of MARPOL, had pretty much a positive outlook on MARPOL. It has essentially changed how ships are designed and operated. And he also produced an interesting number, although we don't know exactly how that number was arrived at, that the number of oil spills fell by over 90% over the last 50 years. And he said, due to this and other targeted intervention, but it's not clear what the causation or how the cause-effect relationship was actually determined there. But nonetheless, the general industry view is that MARPOL has made a difference. And certainly, the various voices from industry seem to suggest, and just scanning the industry literature, that, at least the industry felt that progress had been made. But at the same time, there is kind of a lingering question. But how come we don't have a system yet to determine, to quantify a little bit more scientifically how well MARPOL is actually doing? And my colleague and I, Henrik Ringbohm, recently published this book. We had a large team. Essentially, it's a commentary on MARPOL. And when we were scanning the literature around, we had a hard time finding anything that looked like a scientific assessment of how well MARPOL has actually operated with respect to preventing the various sources of pollution that it aims at. So basically, yes, we accept the general anecdotal, if you want, views out there, but ultimately, we concluded that we need some scholarly work here to determine actually how well MARPOL has actually functioned. It's not that we don't have some indications that things are indeed happening in a positive manner. So for instance, if we look at the Tokyo Memorandum of Understanding, port state control, and we look at violations, detainable violations over the last 3 years, what is interesting here is that you can see significant numbers, yes, but the fact that these deficiencies are being picked up in port state inspections suggests that the system is working as it is intended. What is interesting too is that if we look at the most of the detainable deficiencies here, they have tended to relate to oil filtering equipment, so that's Annex 1 violations. So we do have ship detentions, and port state control appears to suggest that MARPOL is being enforced. So what are the challenges moving forwards? There are quite a few. Just a few words about a few that come to mind, and I'd be happy to listen to others in the room if you think there are other challenges that MARPOL really is facing or has to deal with. I would say the first would be decarbonization. In my study of IMO regulation over the years, I've come to the conclusion that the regulation of air pollution, and specifically the decarbonization of shipping, is by far the most complex issue that it's not just MARPOL, but the IMO has had to deal with. And indeed, IMO has been working on this now for 20 years. And where are we? We still have a long way to go. And we're not even sure that we will be able to adopt a hard target given recent developments. Decarbonization requires a transformation of the industry, transformation of fuel use. And indeed, it's going to require perhaps new rules on ship design, new rules for equipment. And then ultimately, of course, this will have impact on potential trades. It might have impacts on some ports being preferred over others. There will be the first movers that will be able to say, we provide the full range of fuels that ships might need. Others might not be in that position. So we might be in a situation where some ports will be better able to service the needs of ships according to the standards that we'll be adopting than others. Autonomous systems, perhaps just a few words there. I would argue here that perhaps we might see a smaller role for MARPOL because we'll have, if we have more automation on board, if we have fewer people on board, of course, it might be less sewage to deal with, less garbage, and the argument industry would put forward, potentially also less human error. Increased goal-based regulation and use of recognized organizations raises an interesting question with respect to port state control. It'd be interesting here to hear from colleagues in the room if there is someone that has experience with port state control in Singapore. Now that we're moving towards goal-based regulation, what does that mean for port state inspectors? What are they actually looking for? Are they simply looking at the goals? Or are they looking at the classification society standards? And if so, how are they doing that? How are they doing port state control? The III code has demonstrated so far that we have a number of states that are having difficulties implementing MARPOL. And certainly, one of the big issues there is provision of reception facilities. Another major concern, in my view, is consistency of MARPOL, but for that matter, it could be also other IMO regimes, with other instruments of international law, in particular UNCLOS. And the particular issue with respect to, for instance, scrubbers. So I mentioned earlier that I should say a couple of more words on scrubbers. Because the idea behind scrubbers was, really, isn't this a wonderful technology to reduce air pollution because of sulfur? We can significantly reduce sulfur from combustion by using scrubbers. So therefore, the targets that we have in Regulation 14 of Annex 6 can be met not by using more expensive but cleaner fuels, but by introducing machines on board that will enable us to continue to burn heavy fuel oil, and then essentially the emission is cleaner, but the wash water that is produced has created a new source of pollution of the marine environment. So essentially we've been substituting pollution. So we've reduced a problem from a MARPOL's perspective and created a problem from a law of the sea perspective. So those states that are using or are permitting the use of scrubbers, especially open loop scrubbers, as an alternative compliance mechanism under Regulation 4 of MARPOL Annex 6, essentially are putting themselves in a situation where they might not be compliant with Article 192 and other provisions in MARPOL that require them not to transform one form of pollution into another. So consistency between legal regimes. And I find this has been a bit of an issue at the IMO. For some reason, member states of the IMO don't really like to talk about the law of the sea at the IMO. They don't. You notice the bias? They usually try to find a way. Say, oh, we have an issue sometimes. Oh, we'll ask DOELOS, the Division for Ocean Affairs and Law, to give us an opinion. Just send it out, as it were. Although the problem is really at the IMO, and the irony is that UNCLOS provides part of the mandate of the IMO. So if an instrument provides part of your mandate, and you as an organization are authorized to interpret your own mandate, why wouldn't you want to discuss UNCLOS, which is part of your mandate?
Because the people you send don't understand UNCLOS.
It's one of those strange things. Is it?
Institutions resist discussing UNCLOS.
They do.
Insist it's not the IMO's mandate.
Yeah. It's not our instrument, I would think. Yeah. So, folks, I've talked for longer than I thought I would. So a couple of concluding thoughts here, future directions and prospects. MARPOL will continue to respond. I think it has demonstrated over its first 50 years that it's a nimble system. It has been able to adapt. Yes, we can criticize it for being responsive rather than proactive, but it has indeed been adapted to problems as they've been recognized and brought forward to it. But at the same time, I think perhaps this is a message to the IMO at the same time. It needs to be better coordinated with other instruments of international law. And I think there's going to be a particular need for this more than ever now because of the adoption of the BBNJ agreement. Because the BBNJ agreement, in a sense, provides a role for the IMO to enable the use of its own area-based management tools to promote conservation objectives. So the BBNJ COP may designate marine protected areas, but IMO remains the organization that is competent with respect to international shipping, and the only one, or the one that has an exclusive mandate over ship routing. So we're going to be designating marine protected areas on the high seas, and there is the need to provide for routing or rerouting. It's got to be the IMO. So the IMO needs to work with other organizations, not only because those organizations need the IMO, but because it is within the IMO's mandate really to work closely with the other organizations as a specialized agency of the United Nations. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.